to give you some background, Bret and I've told Peter a little bit about this. Bret and I have been talking for a long time, years actually now, about having a conversation about topics, and it originally stemmed, from a desire to kind of constructively engage on the issue of guns. But from the standpoint of people with different viewpoints on the topic, coming together to discuss it in a way that would be informative to people that might hold one of those positions but really not know the background or have the ability to talk to somebody that held a different position from theirs in a rational way, because often these are such polarized conversations that that just can't happen. And so people don't ever see this happen. And so Bret and I had that conversation for a long time, and just have never kind of taken it brought it into reality for a variety of reasons. And so I kind of had the thought of, wow, this would be a really interesting, kind of easier subject to talk through potentially in some ways. And when I thought of, about having the conversation, I thought it'd be interesting to have Peter, and I thought it'd be very interesting to have Ethan. And I'll give a little bit of my perspective of Ethan, which I've told him on occasion. But so just to kind of run through my perspective of people's political beliefs here. So Bret is more conservative, probably on the Republican end of things. Peter and I are generally on the liberal end of things. Ethan is libertarian, or has been libertarian in the past. But the thing that I greatly appreciate about Ethan is that he's very charitable to the people that he might politically disagree with, and able to give them it's very charitable towards them, but also very educational. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to have the libertarian perspective on specifically this topic, and if we tackle other topics as well, that would be also interesting. And so I thought
I'd like to revise my description from you. I think I'm a libertarian leaning.
No, actually, I had a better description for you. Yours just strictly a contrarian. that is your description. It's contrarian. So, anyways,
I fundamentally disagree with that.
So, having said all that, I don't know if that gets at kind of what we might view the purpose of this being. Is a way to kind of potentially provide an example of people of differing viewpoints to discuss.
Yeah.
It is probably less controversial than gun control at this point.
Well, I don't know.
So go ahead, Ethan.
We're trying to get somewhere with this group that other people can't get with their group, I think.
Sure, yeah. And they may not even have a group because they don't know anybody on the opposing end of the spectrum from them.
Yeah, they have an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Yep.
Something that I was thinking about that I don't have a good answer, but I thought could be an interesting discussion to help define our discussion is our thoughts around a definition of freedom.
Okay.
And I think that is paradoxical in nature because it is both insanely personal, and yet every personal decision we make affects society at large. And I think that is kind of what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, so why don't we spend just a minute on kind of, and at least this would be helpful to me, and if others have differing viewpoints, please share them. I was thinking we might spend just a little bit of time kind of talking about what do we want the structure of the conversation to be, because we would have probably some, general items that we would want to hit. I think it might be helpful to start with, us talking about ourselves and where we kind of lay on the ideological spectrum, and maybe briefly why. And then we could talk about the current situation I'm happy to give the medical background to that. And I have a few slides that I've used from a couple of different presentations that I could pull up. And then we could get into the specific topic of masking, which is, I think, would then lead very nicely into what you were talking about, Peter, is what does freedom mean? So anyways, that was my thought. I don't know if others have kind of different thoughts on that.
That sounds like about 16 hours of webcast. We can certainly just start and get as far as we get and come back and continue. If we wanted to nail the masking issue, the current situational masking and liberty issue in one, say, 1 hour session, I'd almost say, let's negotiate the question, like one question, right? And then let each of us answer it, even if some of those answers are similar. And then either let us ask questions of each person or let just each of us respond to each one. But even then, the combinatorials get pretty high. So, and we're going to uncover a lot of topics every time somebody speaks for 2 minutes.
Oh,
so
yeah.
We're going to.
I mean, I do think we need. Yeah, we need some parameters. For the medical topic, I was obviously not going to cover everything related to COVID, but just a couple of things that would influence the way people might think about something like masking, for instance. So I do think it would be helpful for if anybody chose to, if Bret, posts this and anybody chose to listen to it, that we do have some upfront kind of upfront statement of our potential biases. And so just very brief description, I don't have a lot to say about, liberal thought in general. I would just say in general, I am probably along the liberal end of the spectrum, but appreciate that there are, definitely alternative viewpoints within or valuable viewpoints within the conservative and libertarian perspective as well. So anyways, that's, yeah. So what kind of, do we all agree that like an intro kind of like that of each of us, and then we would, I guess, then I could introduce the medical aspects.
Yeah.
And then we can go to the topic of masking.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So who wants to go first?
Chad, why don't you go first, and then we'll start running.
I don't want to go first.
Okay, I'll go first.
You go first, Bret.
And we're just and Ethan, as the only person here I've not actually formally met, it's nice to meet you. Peter, it's excellent to see you again, and even Chad, it's good to see you again too. I haven't seen you in probably a year and change, but
it has been a while since we've seen each other physically.
You guys can't blame COVID for that time.
Yeah, no, that's truly just me not doing my job anymore. So what, and I don't know what you're seeing right now, but if you go clockwise around my screen, it's like the evolution of man with beard. We've got Chad, then me, then Ethan, and then I think Peter, or somebody who signed in under Peter's icon. So
we go from primordial soup to the missing link.
Yeah. I was just thinking stages of puberty, but we'll go with that.
That's actually useful information because that is not the order it goes in. So let's try not to organize anything by the order we see on our screen.
So I'm Bret Mahoney. I live here in Loma Linda, California, but I've lived everywhere. Met Peter and Chad in Guam, spent quality time with them. Peter was pretty much my best friend in high school, with his other brother Alex and our friend Carrie. The four of us were as socially awkward and awesome as things could possibly get for high schoolers, which was great. I'm actually an elected, now I can say this, I'm an elected libertarian official in the city of Beaumont. So wow. I turned in my Republican card a while back, as did the party, and transitioned to a formal libertarian as, of course, as the Republican Party, I think, evolved, and as my own understanding of my beliefs matured. And so I'm, in my mid 30s now, and I feel like I've probably reached at least a somewhat a stable understanding of what I believe and why I believe it. So it's it is on my screen. We have Peter and Chad on the left. We have Ethan and I on the right, and that's how it's going to go out. So I think it's really good.
Beautiful. I'll follow that, I guess. So Chad, Vercio, and I have generally leaned left. So generally liberal, although probably earlier in my life, like at high school time, I would have been on the right side of the spectrum of politics. I think through college is when I started to become more exposed to political, issues, and then started to lean left a little bit because of that. And then probably in part because of my medical training, I think the desire, or the desire, I guess, for justice and health and resolution of health disparities, I think, is one of the things that as I see government being heavily, or at least partially involved, I should say, in that. And so that has, probably pushed me towards the left side of the spectrum. But I definitely see the value in many of the conservative values and even libertarian values. So looking forward to a robust discussion today on those values.
Should we alternate? Ethan, you can go next.
Sure, I'll go next. So I'm Ethan Pooley. I live in Walla Walla, Washington, and I'm 42 at the moment. And I have been a libertarian since I started paying attention and forming my beliefs at all, which was in my early 20s. I met Chad at college up here. And yeah, we've really respected each other ever since. Like Chad, I think you and I could be so far apart on something we could barely even make each other understood. And yet there'd be no answer in that conversation.
I agree. Totally agree. If I remember right, we met in Jensen's logic class, not logic class, his
moral philosophy.
Which one?
Probably intro to logic or moral philosophy.
Yeah, I think it was one of those classes. I think
or
that's
intro
where
to
we met
Phil.
each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was pretty formative for both of us, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would have to say that you're the much brighter student in that area than me, and I think that's one of the reasons I value your perspective so much.
Well, thank you. And for me, yeah, I dream of a voluntary society. I dream of a society that, as much as possible, proceeds through a series of voluntary interactions rather than forceful or coerced interactions. And I wish that the world would hold that up as an ideal more than they do, because there's a lot of places we could do it if we just went, oh, that would be nice.
Right.
And of course, there's some places we can't, and that's why I'm a libertarian and not an anarchist. Although political anarchy is a serious position, it's not just spray painting things.
Right.
And it keeps the libertarians honest about what they think they can get out of government and whether it's realistic. So.
Interesting.
I'm Peter Vercio. I also went to Walla Walla, met Ethan there, have known Chad since I was a baby, and Bret since shortly thereafter. And when I went to Walla Walla, they had done away with such hedonism as Intro to Logic. So I did not have such things informing my thought. But I think as Chad says, I do tend to be contrarian, but I'm a big believer in personal freedom, as well as a believer that there is a place for government in social programs, many of which I think could be done away with UBI. So I am across the spectrum in a lot of ways. I loved getting my letter from Donald Trump with the check he supposedly sent me.
Let's not talk about that.
That was Andrew Yang's dream, right?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so let's set the stage a little bit for our discussion today. we wanted to talk about, the idea of liberty and how we think of individual freedom, and what Peter and I were talking about a little bit yesterday of community responsibility. And hopefully we'll have time to get into, how do we do this without coercion, or is there at some point a place for coercion? And how does that work? So to set the stage, I'm going to, give a little bit of background on, the current situation. We're obviously talking in a time of, a virus that is spread across the U.S. And the world, really, to a significant degree, and kind of set the stage for how this might influence, the way we think about liberty in this age. So just wanted to cover a couple of things, and I don't know where Ethan and Bret, where your knowledge base is on this, but one of the things that's been kind of circulating is that, well, COVID-19 is just like the flu. There's some distinct differences from the from the medical perspective, that it's quite different. Symptomatically, it is often, in many people, or the vast majority of people, symptomatically like the flu, but there's a significant difference in other things that make this situation a lot more challenging than the annual flu that we see every year. The first thing is that the number of days between when you first get infected and then start to see symptoms. So for the flu, that's 1 to 4 days, whereas for COVID-19, that's 2 to 14 days. And so you can have somebody who theoretically, gets infected today. They start to show symptoms 2 weeks from now, and then 3 weeks from now, they get hospitalized. And worst case scenario, 4 to more weeks from now, they die from their infection or the complications of it. And so that's a very, very different from the flu, very different scenario from the flu, which is, 1 to 4 days. The other big difference with COVID is that it is infectious before before people are symptomatic. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to scroll through, which I didn't have in this presentation, I'm realizing. But it's infectious for days before before the symptoms start. And that makes it really, really challenging from a public health perspective. The flu is infectious for a little bit before the symptoms start. It's about a day. Whereas COVID is infectious, it seems like, for potentially at least 4 days before people start to have symptoms. And therefore, they can be going to the grocery store, they can be going to a church, they can be going to, whatever venue they might go to, and be infectious, but not have any idea that they are infectious. Now, we don't really fully understand the model of when does that peak infectious period hit? But it does seem like actually their peak infectious period is before they have symptoms, which is kind of scary. So, so that's one of the things that's in the background for this. And then if you look at countries that have handled this reasonably well, in the Asian countries, that they have really kind of slowed the spread through their countries, one of the things that they have used is masking. And the thought for that is not so much that the mask protects you as the wearer. It might a little bit. If you're wearing an N95 mask, it would affect that quite well. But if you're wearing a surgical mask or a cloth mask, it's probably not gonna be real. It'll be somewhat effective for protecting you, but not real effective. But that it could really protect others from getting infected from you if you are an asymptomatic carrier. So that's a little bit about the medical background. I don't know if you guys had any other questions about kind of that setting that would help us inform our discussion.
Why did I see nothing about Bill Gates or 5G in that presentation?
Yeah, you
I
got
don't know. I haven't fully vetted that connection yet. Sorry, Ethan, I talked over you. What did you say?
I said you have the wool pulled over your eyes, man.
Apparently I do. Yes.
No, I don't have any objection to that overview. I've been trying to follow pretty closely, and it's definitely the infection fatality rate has got to have a floor several times higher than the flu at this point. And particularly, which you didn't touch on, I didn't hear, is just the novelty of it. is is a big part of what's creating the rushes at some hospitals. Unfortunately, the others are going out of business, but but it's what's creating a big chunk of our problem. If this had been running around for 20 years, maybe we would be just treating it like the flu, but that's not.
Yeah, and I didn't want to get too far into the medical background of like the pathophysiology of COVID, but it's probably important to speak to that. It is quite different in the people that get really sick. It is quite different from the flu. So the severity of lung disease is very different from the flu. From my friends that work in the ICU physicians, usually if somebody gets has respiratory severity that they go to the ICU with the flu, they're, a small number of them die. I mean, obviously people die from the flu every year, but they either get better fairly quickly within a week, or they die, and it's a small number that die. But COVID, they're there for weeks and weeks and weeks and really have very severe lung disease. But there's also a couple of other things that COVID seems to cause that have made this really complicated, which is vascular injury. So they're causing strokes, heart attacks, kidney failure, and then there's also this, basically inflammatory response syndrome that probably, plays into somewhat that vascular injury, but is also distinct. And we have some treatments for those things, but we don't really understand how effective they are at this point. We're starting to. But that's a whole nother kind of complication of how this is different from the flu. Yeah, absolutely.
So are there any real differences of opinion here about the severity and communicability? Because if so, we wouldn't be discussing the same thing.
No, I think I can certainly, I would see that Chad is the expert in this group as far as I understand. And he's never led me wrong before, so.
Little do you know, Brett.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, sorry, go ahead. Somebody was
No, I would say I think that's an important distinction to make, though. We're all starting with the same baseline understanding of maybe not necessarily all responses to COVID, but certainly if we're all in agreement that a society that wears masks is safer from COVID than a society that doesn't wear masks. Right? That's kind of the baseline that we're all trying to make sure we're at before we discuss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm there. That was definitely a question at the beginning, and our nation kind of went, masks.
Yeah.
They do that in wherever, Singapore.
Singapore, right? Hong Kong.
We don't need that. Those paranoid
don't
people,
have
they do
COVID.
that every year. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll have to say, our community, if you would have told me 2 months ago, well, yeah, probably 2 months ago now, it's a good idea to wear a mask at this point, I would have said, why? Like, it's not effective. It's not effective at preventing, me from getting the infection. So it's not that effective. But that was when we didn't know that there was a degree of asymptomatic spread, and that really you were trying to protect the other person in wearing the mask. And so, yeah, definitely our position of health, you have the Surgeon General saying like, this is ridiculous, we wouldn't wear masks, and who obviously has changed his opinion on that. So our opinion in the medical community has evolved, certainly. But there's, this has become a liberty issue for some groups of people. Is like, I shouldn't, I shouldn't be required to wear a mask by my government. And so that posed to me an interesting question of liberty. And this is real so I live in San Bernardino County, and then I work in Riverside County. And just to give you some regional context, San Bernardino County removed they about a month ago put in place an order that if you did not wear a mask, it was potentially $1,000 fine. And it was a strict order. And then Riverside County actually had preceded them, but didn't have that fining capacity that I'm aware of, associated with it. Both counties have kind of had an interesting relationship with their county public health officers in the last week, and have rescinded the order for masking for San Bernardino County, and have changed some of the public health policies for closure of businesses and that kind of thing for Riverside County. all across the U.S. I mean, I obviously have friends on Facebook that are in the Northwest, quite a few, and they've raised this question of, is my liberty not to wear a mask? And I don't think they fully understand the reasons behind why it's a good idea to wear a mask. But where does that level? Is there a role for whether it's local government of the county public health or city health or state, health offices, or federal to, mandate wearing of a mask? And so, yeah, I thought that would be kind of an interesting topic to discuss.
To me, I think one of the things you have to look at is what is the level of freedom I'm giving up to the level of safety that I'm ensuring to my community. And as the resident contrarian, I find it to be insanity that something as simple as a mask is now being used as a symbol of freedom. Like it's almost like they think they're the founding fathers to go to the grocery store without a mask on, and I don't feel like there's an equivalent to the Boston Tea Party, So I think, if at least for me, the thought around that is then, like I said, is like, what freedom am I giving up? What's the level of discomfort then for this action? And with this one, there's nothing. My nose gets rubbed a little raw.
Well, my glasses fog out.
Yes.
And as somebody who certainly, first, well, I guess a quick story to illustrate this. So yesterday, Riverside County actually did away with the mandate to wear masks.
Right.
So this morning, every Saturday morning, I get up and go to one of our local bakeries, and they do a kind of like, it's not a curbside pickup. They let one customer in the store to pick up an order. So every Saturday morning, I go to the bakery, I pick up an order for my mother-in-law, and then an order for my wife and I. And then we eat ridiculously good baked goods all weekend. And this morning I went in, and the owner and his wife, who makes everything, and their employee are all in there, and they're all masked. And I went in and I got my mask on and went in and was paying for my things. And as I was walking out, the guy who was standing outside the door said, "Hey, you don't have to wear that anymore. They said you don't have to wear it." And he was dead serious, and he wasn't wearing a mask. And I said, "I know." I said, "But I choose to wear it because I understand that I'm going into a place that makes and sells food, that there's a benefit to me not getting, potentially spreading whatever I have, if it's COVID or if it's the flu or whatever, in this space." And so I just said that I choose to wear it and got in the car. And it was kind of like I'd blown his mind that I'd chosen to do something that I didn't have to do. And I think that that's where the clear distinction needs to be made between what the government tells us we have to do and what we as an informed society choose to do. And I think the key term that Ethan used earlier, and I won't go into this because I'm sure that you have things that you can talk about that are much more informed on this, is the voluntary society. But that was, I think, an example of it. It doesn't take away any of my freedoms, or rather, let me back up. It doesn't inconvenience me to wear a mask outside of the itchy nose and the fact that I have to smell my own breath at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is not a pleasant thing. But I do believe that there is danger in saying this doesn't affect me, so I won't necessarily support the larger discussion of the erosion of civil liberties. It's that same conversation we have about guns, right? What does a bullet button make a gun less fun to operate? Why does a bullet button make a gun less deadly? Well, why does a bullet button infringe your Second Amendment rights? Well, why does it go, and so we can kind of start to think about how different decisions that we've made as a collective governmental body have slowly started to eat into some very practical and I think more substantial aspects of our civil liberties. And so I appreciate what you said, Peter, but I also think that there is a danger both in the now and then as we look at investing in decisions for the future in being that specific about people's behaviors.
So I would say, and I agree with you, because I would say I'm looking at it from a personal point of view rather than a legislative point of view. it doesn't cost me anything to wear this thing. Does that mean that the government should tell me to wear this thing? That's a whole different question.
Well,
and so
go ahead, Ethan.
It's partially a different question. But while you were talking, Peter, I thought of something I wanted to point out. On the legal side of this, courts are highly practical. And when presented with two conflicting issues or principles, they weigh the relative burdens imposed on each one, right? And while the principles of civil liberty and autonomy and wandering around town carrying out your normal business are very crucial, the burden of mask wearing is low on most ways you can measure it. And especially, this is a temporary measure. I mean, it's as temporary as it needs to be in any event. This isn't something that's too prone to being blown out of proportion by government for too long. I mean, if we end up gaining ground on the biology of this thing, then we'll take these things back. It's not like there's a group out there that wants to force masks on everybody all the time. Unlike there are groups out there that would like to see an America with no guns. And I think that's important because the practicality of the legal system is where a lot of its usefulness comes from. And it makes our laws bend rather than break. And to what Bret was talking about, I reviewed a couple of books before we started this, and one of them was a little-known book by Philip Soper called "The Ethics of Deference," and it's a beautiful book. In fact, the title might even tell you all you need to know. It raises the topic of deference in citizens, and he suggests that a lot of people have questioned how much authority the law carries. And in modern political theory, there aren't good answers. The end result is kind of, and it doesn't carry a lot of authority. That's probably why it has guns. But he says, even if the law has no authority, the individual may still have strong reasons to defer. They may have very rational, very wise reasons to defer to the stated intentions and wishes of their fellow citizens or of their government. And that sounds to me like what you suggested, Bret, to this fellow outside the bakery that kind of blew his mind. It's like, well, there's always deference. You could just defer to the views of others, even when you disagree with them. And going along with that is the notion that the state's claim to be acting justly in a situation is not the claim that the state is infallible and that it's right this time about this thing. The only claim the state needs to make in order to be acting justly is that it's not culpable. It's not being grossly negligent. It doesn't have, intentions different than it should have, and it's not being grasped for the aggrandizement of one person, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we're looking at a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty. There's tons of uncertainty. There's direct uncertainty from COVID, like we just don't understand this virus yet and what it's going to mean biologically. There's indirect uncertainty. We don't know what it means when we shut down the economy for 2 months. We have no idea what happens next. In uncertain situations, governments are going to make mistakes all over the place. But are they culpable, right? Or are they doing the best they can? And if they're doing the best they can, citizens, I believe, still have a strong reason to defer unless there's true pain coming down the wire, right? And so when we start talking about money and livelihoods and the government isn't making up the difference, that's when I start caring a lot about the civil liberties discussion and going, I don't think anybody should stop you from doing that thing. But if we're talking about wearing a mask to the bakery, to me, there's not much to say there. That's very, very reasonable under the circumstances. And I think citizens have such strong reasons to defer that that's probably where I think the conversation should end in their minds.
So let me ask for clarification from you, Ethan. By defer, do you mean defer to their fellow community, or defer to the state's, say, mandate or recommendation or whatever it happens to be?
Yeah, I mean, accept the judgment of the group over their own in something that is largely a non-moral issue. Right? It's just a small practical thing. And I always answer that in terms of scope. If the people who believe COVID's like the flu and so forth, they have their bar somewhere and they all want to show back up and not use masks. I tend to think we should be like, okay, it's your people and families that are going to be the epicenter of that little outbreak. But that for the true, when it comes down to the downtown area and carrying out their businesses and everything, that they should defer to both the state and the majority, which both right now, if I'm looking at the surveys right, are saying, let's take this seriously, let's distance, let's use masks, let's use all the tools at our disposal. And it seems like those ought to go hand in hand with wanting to reopen the economy. And that's something there have been some articles on lately. It's like, why do the people that want to reopen not want to wear masks? Right. And it seems like you scratch the dirt a little bit, and there's just the political position underneath it.
Yeah. So I want to raise, a distinction that story that you told, Bret, kind of it created several thoughts for me. One is, we obviously have no idea what this dude behind you at the bakery what his background was. There's a couple of possible, different ways that he could be. One could be that he which I just in the brief conversation sounds a little unlikely, but one is he could be a rule follower. Like he says, the state said this, I will do it. They said now I don't have to do it, I will not do it. That's one potential scenario for his position on this. Another potential position could be that he was like, the state told me to do this, I don't want to do it, but I did it until they said I don't have to, and now, thank goodness, I don't have to wear it anymore. That's another potential. And I guess the reason that those distinctions are or those possible scenarios are important to me is because there is, of course, another option, which would be somebody that was informed and said, hey, I'm going to find out, the value of wearing the mask. It's not a big inconvenience to me. And, what's the benefits and risks associated with it? And they could try to be informed. And then I think we would have seen this dude volunteering to wear the mask. But obviously not everybody fits into that category. And so how does the state, when it is trying to serve its community, whether that's, I think we're referring to the state broadly here, right? Like that could include county public health, that could include the state, public health entities, and it could include federal. But in general, when the state is trying to deal with the citizens of all different kind of educational levels and everything, what is its role in say recommending versus mandating versus enforcing? And it seems like there would be some value for this guy to at least have had the state recommend wearing a mask. That would have probably provided some value because of whatever his background bringing into this conversation or into that scenario. It would have provided some value. So I guess I'm curious on that. Is like, what do you think about the common thing or refrain about liberals would be that liberals are all about government enforcement. And there's definitely some truth to that. But where do we think on this spectrum of recommendation, mandate, enforcement, et cetera, I'm just curious about everybody's thoughts about that.
I tend to agree with what Ethan just said, is that this is a temporary thing. It's not a huge loss of freedom. There aren't groups telling us we want you to wear masks for the rest of your lives. And so that's one that I'm pretty okay with the state of Colorado saying if you're going to go into a retail store, you need to wear a mask. I'm pretty comfortable with that. Just for instance, to how I think about things, the stay-at-home order was much scarier to me than having somebody need to wear a mask in a store.
That's next week's episode.
Yeah.
I cut you off, Peter, or I interrupted you, Peter, or was that your thought?
No, I was done with my thought.
Okay.
I really agree with the way Ethan put that it is a temporary thing. It's clearly a temporary thing, and it's not a huge infringement on our freedoms.
So,
but you don't get they're conditioning you, Peter.
I feel. I'll just start all of my statements with I feel. That is most important. Like,
you just won ultimate snowflake on here, Brett.
Well, I mean, and truly, my opinion on this is that's a more. I agree with what I think with the spirit of what everybody's saying, as I understand it, and I think we're kind of, each of us is preaching to the choir that we want to live in a society that is responsible. And this is what we see as a responsible act collectively to support and prevent this from.
And that doesn't get mad at other members of society when they're just trying to be responsible.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the gentleman who I had the exchange with today, he wasn't offended that I was wearing a mask. He was just kind of blown away by that, by like why I would choose to continue to do this. But I see it more being more constructive that the county health have guidelines saying this is what we find, this is what the data suggests at this point, right? Because it's evolved every week since we started having these conversations in different ways. But masks are an important part of preventing the spread of COVID. These are our recommendations. Now, if that bakery wants to not let people into the bakery who aren't wearing a mask, then that is, I mean, it's like the people who say I can't bring my gun into their establishment. And I can't bring my gun into a county courthouse. The county has said, you don't do this. Or the state has said, if you go to a state building, you can't bring your gun. And I feel like
you have to be in Michigan for that.
That's next week's episode, Peter. but I really see we turn to the state or the city or the county to tell us what we can and can't do, or what we should and shouldn't do. And that's a whole other issue. But private industry has the ability to make up the difference between if I'm in a county space, if I'm on a county park trail, if I'm in a county or a city beach, if I'm anywhere that's owned by or managed by or governed by that entity, I should be following their rules. And if I go into Target, and Target as a rule has said, when you shop at our stores, you need to be wearing a mask. That's Target taking a stand and saying we can refuse service to people who don't wear shirts. We can refuse service to people who don't wear shoes. And that's the whole thing, the shirts and shoes refusal. That's not just because we don't want to see people's bellies. That's because there are health and safety concerns for the community that come from people not wearing shoes and not wearing shirts into establishments.
Can I ask just a clarifying question on that? Would that extend to, like, say, a sidewalk or a road? Is it anything owned by the government, by the public at large? Yeah,
I would say if the city of Beaumont, California decides that you need to wear a mask while on city property, and the sidewalk in front of my house is a city-owned sidewalk. So I know if I'm going to walk down and get the mail, I'm going to wear my mask and I'm going to follow the rules of the city. Now, if I'm standing in my front yard watering, that's my property. I can wear or not wear a mask. And if somebody wants to come onto my space and have a conversation with me, I can ask them to put a mask on. And I think we can extend that to corporate entities as well.
So I want to go ahead, Ethan.
It was mostly by way of agreement here. I think that's the strong default. I was going to mention property rights. Most of the property we live our lives on outside of our house isn't ours. It's either private property, somebody else's private property, or it's community property. And a lot of people are pretty happy to say, I mean, even forget COVID. a bakery could say, you wear a mask if you use our store. That would be completely legal. It would not be expected. But most people on both sides of the political spectrum would go, okay, I guess they could say you had to wear a red shirt too. I don't know how they pay their rent, but more power to them. Those things aren't protected classes in our society. And then there's community property.
That should be our conversation for the future, because Ethan and I haven't gone back and forth. We're really packing next week's episode, by the way.
That's right.
Sorry to interrupt you, Ethan.
And the subclass of red shirts do need some protection, I hear. So then there's community property. And that's a whole other issue, obviously, but it's not just ours. And reminding people of that without getting their hackles up, I think, may be part of the way towards getting them to feel a little differently. Remember, the street isn't just for you. And it's not as simple as it is if you happen to be middle-aged and healthy or young and healthy. There's a grandma toddling her way down to the store, and there's immunocompromised people that are perfectly capable of living normal lives, being productive members of our economy, but not if you're walking around spewing COVID all over the street, right? And even if they're too scared and we're all reacting wrong, what I said is still true. They're not going to be able to be out there. They're going to choose not to be out there because you chose not to wear the mask. So when it comes to community property, yeah, there's lots of stuff we need to watch out for long term of not getting it carved out of our control. But again, temporary, mild restrictions in place, and we don't own that space that we're in. We're just participants.
I'd like to ask a question pointed towards Ethan and Bret on that, because I like the theory you guys are putting forth, where businesses can say if you're going to come in here, you have to wear a mask. But there's a group that's impacted by this that doesn't have choice. And so if, like, in your example, Ethan, if everybody goes to the bar and they all get COVID and we have 500 patients, from that, the medical community doesn't have a choice in that. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that and the impact to your theory around businesses having the freedom to decide
that. I think that's there's ripples in the pond in all of our choices, because that person who goes to that bar could get in their car, which is an illegal act, after they've legally consumed alcohol without their mask on, and could
hopefully not with their mask on.
Yeah, they should make little straw holes that, I don't know, we can fill up an air mattress. We can have that same little valve. But
this is going to quickly become R-rated.
An individual can consume the alcohol in the bar without their mask on, get in a car, and kill somebody. Now, they've broken a law in that we penalize the intoxicated driving, but we don't penalize the intoxication. And so if we're talking about infectious disease, okay, maybe a better example, when AIDS was such a huge part of our public health conversation, and not ours because we were all quite young at that point, but was a large part of the public health conversation. There was education that certainly had to be done, and I think was done. There was social acceptance that had to be done, and that has happened as well. There was a great risk to the healthcare community with those patients as well. Would it have been appropriate? And I don't know. Would it have been appropriate for the government to say all sexual interactions require a condom until we can wrap our mind around this? Am I comparing apples to oranges? Or are we trying to figure out the different grades of damage or threat or danger that we and our individual actions pose to the healthcare community and the community at large?
Let me jump in, since initially, Peter, you posed that to both of us. Let's get both of these out there, and then you guys can respond.
Good, because Ethan's going to make a better argument than I just did.
I'm not sure. I just saw them. I saw both eyes go up to the creative side of the brain. They're both.
I was like, government mandated condoms. This is gonna. There's gonna be a whole lot of discussion on that.
Can we just wear the condom over our head? So Bret touched on something that I felt like I almost I didn't, but personally I discovered it. Like, I didn't read it anywhere, but 10 years ago or so, it just kind of coalesced in my head, and I went, man, so much of what we argue about, especially the libertarian versus non-libertarian views of things, they're just about risk control and burdens of proof and acceptable levels of risk, and in particular, the extent to which an individual is allowed to unilaterally impose risk on other people. And where I went from there is to say, now, does it matter if they're imposing risk unilaterally, and it's 1 in a billion chance of death by smoking a cigarette in the park for a passerby, or by drinking under the legal limit of alcohol and driving, but they're slightly impaired, or some other thing. And I realized, as a society, we don't run almost any of those numbers. And if we did, we'd come up with very different answers that our gut tells us. And so we run on intuition, and we run on our value systems. We go like if I decide to drive downtown rather than walk, I'm unilaterally imposing risk on every pedestrian and every person in a car. It's easy to kill a pedestrian in a car. If I walk, I'm not going to be killing anybody, no matter what I do wrong, right? I'm allowed to unilaterally impose that risk on society. Nobody bats an eyelash. If that's the issue, is the amount of risk, then the way I view it is, we should tell people what their allowance is and let them spend it how they like, right? It shouldn't come down to values like, well,
system.
Society values the convenience of cars, so you can all impose risk on each other with cars. But we all think cigarettes are smelly, so even if it's 1/10 of the likelihood, you can't smoke at the park anymore. I go, like, to me, that has no moral basis. And I start going, okay, government's getting screwy here. Because primarily, to me, the perfect government is the one that can contain multifarious societies with very different values. That's like a wonderful, successful government, has all these people that fundamentally disagree about lots of things, and they're just happily interacting and carrying out market interactions and having a good time and meeting at the bar. And so that's what I take out of what you're saying, Bret, is I look at it and I go, yeah. What's our ability to impose risk unilaterally on each other? And then I follow it to the hospital, and I go, this is a strange time, and hospitals don't do this, and it's against most medical codes of conduct. But personally and legally, I say we need to let them react to this situation. And if they know or want to even reach out in the community and start determining whether people are putting themselves at risk or not, and triage based on that, or even deny treatment, I go for it. I bet people will wear masks if they realize the hospital is going to go, oh, not you, Bob. You were outside the bakery the other day and blah, 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 blah. Right? All of a sudden, we'd see masks all over the place.
3 people are going to watch this, and one of them is going to be Bob outside the bakery for some reason.
Well, he knows where you live. He doesn't know about you.
Yeah, Bret's going to get a nightstick to the knees next Saturday.
Yeah, that's right. Fortunately, I was wearing a mask.
So that raises a lot of interesting questions, Ethan, and I agree with you that what different political kind of perspectives are evaluated is exactly risk, and generally the liberal end of the spectrum is less risk tolerant for, especially health risks. And so feel like recommendations or mandations and enforcement are valuable ways to minimize that risk. I, as a healthcare provider, I think it'd be really, really challenging. And this is, I think, where we probably differ a little bit more in our political viewpoint and view of freedom.
Yeah, my suggestion was highly theoretical for hospitals. I realize yeah.
No, I wasn't meaning. Sorry,
it is important in the sense that it may be that the way this falls out, it really sucks for hospitals. But the problem is a requirement that they've accepted on themselves that doesn't work very well under the circumstances. And even if it's very impractical to change that kind of promise to the community now, that it may be the least impractical thing at some point. But sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's okay. I think, and this probably will transition, I think, maybe to a good idea, the concept of freedom or the different concepts of freedom. But before we get there, I did kind of want to go back to this idea of recommendation and mandation and enforcement. And those are different ways to affect the risk to a community. And we decide at some point, does the risk create no recommendation at all? We feel like like you said, the risk of driving, I'm sure. I mean, I guess we have driver's ed and things like that to maybe decrease the risk a little bit. But there's that kind of approach to it. Then there's recommendations where we feel like the risk is high enough to warrant recommendations. Then there's situations where we feel like the risk, well, at least some people feel like the risk is high enough to recommend mandation and enforcement. And so I wanted to go back to that a little bit and see if we can explore that a little bit more from our different political perspectives. And I also wanted to highlight that part of the reason that I think individual businesses, as you pointed out, Bret, have taken strong stances on this is because of the government stance. So I highly doubt that Target would have come out with its guidance without Riverside Public Health. And actually, from my understanding, Riverside County Public Health has driven this at a state level. We were one of the first counties to actually recommend this. And then it became a statewide mandate. But my sense is that Target would not have been as strong on it if public health had said, well, this is a recommendation that we have. And so there is this interplay between government and the private sector that the way government approaches, this mitigation of risk influences the approach of the private sector. So
I think that to add to that, I think that also is going to lead us into a states' rights discussion. So,
yeah. Interesting. Okay.
And I think, I don't disagree that probably county recommendations or state recommendations or federal recommendations, if you think about an organization as large as Target, right, they're not going to leave it up to the Redlands Target to make that decision by themselves. Target is going to say, this is what we're doing at Target stores across our system. And that's a much more difficult decision for them to make, both because of potential revenue losses and making a statement in a controversial period.
Well, and regional differences too. I mean, that's been one of the challenges, I think,
right.
for states making this decision is just the regional differences. And Target as a, organization, them making a decision for South Dakota and California at the same time is a challenge. And so, yeah, I mean, private entities, I have a friend that practices medicine within kind of a corporate setting. And so his practice is influenced by what the corporation decides for their corporate side of things, which makes no sense when you're trying to actually make decisions for kids that might need vaccines, yeah, of whether you can open them and bring them in or not. And so, I mean, this challenge of decision making across regions is not just state, I guess, is what my intention of pointing that out was.
Is your friend an urgent care provider in Bakersfield?
Good one. No.
Okay.
He is not.
He devoted his life to exactly this.
Yes. Good.
Oh man, my life is devoted to immunology and microbiology, but I have chosen to be an entrepreneur of urgent cares across Southern California instead of spending my time in a lab and owning a lab. I'll just leave that.
It's unfortunate that everything is politicized, because I'm sure there's truth. It's that whole thing, two things can be true. Like, there are things that I'm sure were absolutely positively repugnant to other healthcare providers that happened during that. But then there are also probably some truths that we're ignoring because of everything else. But I guess what I was going to say about Target is in kind of to your point, as an organization that operates, I don't know how many stores, but in pretty much every major town across the country, they can also, as a system, say, we do leave it up to our regional managers, or we do leave it up to each general store manager. A Target in Upper Peninsula, Michigan is going to be very different than a Target in Detroit. So as private businesses, there's certainly many, many fewer layers of bureaucracy for a company like Target to be able to make that sort of a decision amongst its leadership within the business. But I brought it up because I wanted to point back to the comment that you made, Chad, about looking to your county and kind of taking your hints and your cues from what government has told us to do. I think that there's value in that, because I think if we trust our governments and we're electing governments that we trust, then there's value that they're giving us the most up-to-date information. But I also believe that we've created a culture of the government told us to, so we will, that has put us where we are now in all forms of this argument. And so do we want to continue that trend? Do we want to start reshaping, as somebody who believes in the lowest level or lowest influence of government possible, do we want to try to reshape our understanding of government's role moving forward? And do we use COVID as the lever to help us kind of change what we expect the government to tell us to do versus ask us to do? So.
Yeah, and piling onto that, since I've done a lot of going, I don't have a problem with masks, I'll grab some libertarian cred back by saying, I get a lot of the protests that's going on, not about the masks so much, I don't get that so much, but about the reopening. A lot of people on the other side don't seem to understand that commerce is life. And they don't seem to understand that vast instant changes to centralization, centrally planned economies, or a lot of printed money for everybody, are a lot more uncertain than actually just going out there and getting back to work, and are dangerous in their own ways. Also, there's been just a fumbling of the messaging of this. I mean, there have been some governors, and I think it was Michigan or Illinois or something, but it was where the lockdown protests started, and it was because some ridiculous stuff was locked down. And people said, we're trying to flatten the curve, not take it to zero. We don't know how to take it to zero. Why can't I go out on my boat? Or why can't I work in my garden or get a plant for my garden or something? And and there was kind of at least how it played in the response was a little Marie Antoinette, a little, well, you don't need gardens this time of year anyway. What are you fussing about? Well, it doesn't take much of a read that that's the attitude from government before you'll have people with guns on the doorstep, right? Because that attitude in government is a huge problem, and it's one that a lot of people feel they need to constantly protect against. So when governments go and lock things down, they need to be very clear why. But they also need to do a lot of messaging and signaling that they deeply respect the things that they're currently trotting on. And boy, if you get that a little wrong, out come the pitchforks. And I feel mixed about that. I go, really, guys, pitchforks? Wasn't the virus enough? But on the other hand, I go, how does a country stay free? Even our founding fathers didn't know. And we've lost a lot of autonomy at state and local levels in the last 240 years. And the pitchforks are one of the only things that has kept a hold of some of it. So, that's not going to fly in our county, and nobody's going to run on that platform. That's the stuff that has kept us in places. So I do think that the state comes into condemnation for some of the reaction. I think they've caused some of the reaction. And that's a lesson I hope they take. And it's not all about just our views of government or even about what's right in the current situation. It's about the care that we take with one another's freedoms.
Yeah, and I do think it's really critical, what you talked about, the uncertainty, and the economic uncertainty. I mean, it's immense. The damage is immense. I mean, I think it's important that anybody that's talking about this acknowledge that, because, obviously businesses will be destroyed, whether that's at the, corporate businesses or small businesses. I mean, probably both. Actually, my wife was telling me that that soup plantation planning on never reopening. And so this is going to fundamentally change kind of society. And like you said, the pitchforks at some point, even though I might strongly disagree with their reason for protest or their method of protest, have in a sense protected our democracy, even though I wish they would also find other things to equally protest, as far as civil rights. But I still want to get back to this. It's been interesting overall that if you had to split based on just political affiliation and the response at the governor level to this, there's probably been somewhat of a divide, although it's not probably as big as some people think. There's been definitely a divide on that risk management kind of idea that in general liberal governors have probably been at the more extreme, not even extreme, but more pro lockdown and risk mitigation, whereas some Republican governors have been at the other end of that spectrum, and then some from both have been tried to be in the middle. I think of Governor DeWine from Ohio, Republican, but he was it seems like from what I've read of Ohio, very, very moderate as far as trying to make sure that he was doing the best job possible to protect his populace, but at the same time acknowledging these deep risks. And in part, this is communication. Maybe the other Midwest governor that you were mentioning just really did fail to communicate that they understood, and so that's really important. But how do we, going back to this, I think pointing to you, Ethan and Bret, since you're on the probably more conservative end of involvement of government, at what point, would the enforcement of masking be reasonable? And that changes over time,
hold on,
based on risk.
I think there is something important that Ethan said, and I think one of the things that we do need to talk about that has not been done well, I think, is messaging. Because one of the things we've seen with government is when they take away a right, they're rarely going to give it back. We haven't gotten back our rights since 9/11. And so when those acts were passed, those have not been returned to us. And I think the messaging around stay-at-home orders is incredibly important and has been done poorly. And
since if you want to talk about that first, I guess I'm curious on more effective methods that you think would be out there for that. For instance,
well, we need follow through. We need follow through to have trust. They said everybody's going to stay at home, but we're gonna jump in and we're gonna protect businesses and jobs and we're gonna pay payroll. And then they gave us maybe an eighth of the money that was needed, and half the people that need it can't get it.
And organizations like the Lakers are getting money when small businesses aren't.
And the Lakers should get money because their employees are as important as anybody else's employees. And I don't mean the basketball players. I mean the guy that mops the gym floor.
Agreed.
And the citizenry gets that wrong. We go, oh, the Lakers, everybody must be a billionaire, not the janitor. Right. But everybody does need to get it, including the mom and pop.
Agreed. But I think that's where messaging comes in. And should we make sure that we're messaging that smaller mom and pop businesses are getting that when it's the Lakers are one of the first large scale businesses to get those loans? And I think that's incredibly important for small business owners to see.
Right. So I guess I was thinking of messaging a little bit differently. I mean, I think, if we want to try to tackle the economic messaging that and economic legislative policy, that seems like an impossible task. But I was wondering about specifically the public health messaging and everything, because for two reasons. One is, I think our county public health office has been, we've been as proactive as we can, I think, with, press conferences and things like that. We've had out of our county hospital, we've run a daily webinar that all the hospitals are invited to participate in. And clearly the message, about even something as simple as masking hasn't gotten out. And contrast that with the federal level of messaging, which has relied on the executive branch, to say it correctly. Contrast that to South Korea, where they pretty much divorced politics from the public health efforts. And so they had daily conferences from their national public health officers that were responding to the public health aspects of this. And obviously South Korea approaches very differently. I don't want to get into the specifics of that other than say that they had a very different testing strategy. And so that vastly influenced or testing capacity, which vastly influenced the way they approach this. But the communication, I'm curious about how we could do communication better to mitigate the need to mandate and enforce on this.
And I think that's where, again, practically, I think we shift away as much as possible from government or the at least highest level of government in that conversation. Not just because I'm a libertarian and I don't believe we should listen to what our president says. That's not it at all. But we've politicized everything at the federal level for every issue that's come across since really even before 2016, but certainly more so since 2016, that I think it's irresponsible for us to look at the communication strategies that are happening at the federal level and try to use that as some sort of indicator. I think that there's a broad appreciation for Fauci. I think that for the most part is bipartisan. I don't see a lot of people calling him a hack. His recommendations may be called into question, though his science doesn't seem to be questioned very much. But I work at a hospital in San Bernardino County. I know that there's a dashboard that I can look at to see San Bernardino County cases. I know that because I was in a webinar with the hospital system that I work for that told me go here and look at this dashboard. So I did, and I have it up and I look at it all the time. As a citizen of Riverside County, if something doesn't come across my local community Facebook group, I don't have any information. I get the daily updates from the hospital I work for. And I don't think that that's a lack of, I would say that I care more about what's going on in the healthcare community with COVID than the average American because it directly affects me. It's a selfish interest. But if I run the bakery...
Oh, sorry.
I
interrupted.
No, I was just saying.
I'm curious because Riverside County has a dashboard as well that I've looked at, and I've looked at both San Bernardino and Riverside's because I was hosting a webinar for Riverside for a couple of weeks, and so I would basically review the stats for each county every morning. But I guess you mentioned Facebook as a platform. I'm curious, like, how do counties effectively, I agree with you that the national level is so politicized that it's hard for, say, Fauci or Deborah Birx to get a word in and have credibility. but how do the counties more effectively communicate this, for people?
You can't just expect the community at large to engage with the county leadership when there's a tragedy, when there's an issue. So I think the issue lies not in our reaction to COVID, but in our reaction to society. How do we feel as a community? Do we trust our leadership? And do we feel like we have a sense of what's good for the other members of our community? I live in a town in here, Beaumont, California, that had its entire city council, I think, save one member, embezzle $42 million. I think about 8 years ago, indicted for embezzling that much money. That's money we're never going to see again. There is a high level of distrust when it comes to the local government and the people who live in this community. But it's like all things. It's like our families. If we're not constantly engaging with them and developing our communicative relationship, then we can't expect that community to respond positively when we need to shout something at them. And that may be the only way we communicate that information. Other people aren't going to have the same access to that information that you and I do. And so aside from just looking at, are we engaging with them in social media more frequently? Are we doing more town halls? I think there are steps that you can take to give people the news, but to get them to trust the news, that's a process that we've lost years ago, at least in this space.
Yeah, I see a lot of this as a falling down that's a long time in coming, because you can't just, it's one of the big reasons, but the payment for it is always dead. The bill's always going to come later. You can't pile everything you ever wanted on the government with all the attendant bickering and disagreement that comes with that, because there's some stuff we really want from government. And one of the things we really want is when we're faced with a biological threat from overseas is for everybody to go, gosh, this is like World War II or something, right? And sit down, shut up, and follow the script until we're safe enough to get back to our normal lives. And that's an imperfect narrative here, but it's great when your government has enough trust to do that. And for example, Scandinavian countries, governments do. For better or for worse, there's some reasons that they don't speak, they're not anything to be proud of, like they're very homogenous and so forth. Nevertheless, they have that ability, and it'd be nice to have that ability now. And we've traded it away for who knows what over the last 20 years as we've moved more and more up to the federal level of government.
I agree. And I think, Bret, your point is really good. Yours as well, Ethan, is like, we need more communication from the local government. And I think there can be trust at that level that can be built going forward in a way that the federal government never will be able to again, I think. That shattered, some people would say with JFK being assassinated, that was when the federal government lost their trust. But whenever that shattered, I think the local government can build that trust. And I was thinking, what would it take for me to feel like I have trust in my local government as we're going through something like COVID? And for me, and specifically in taking away our rights and saying, you need to be inside your house for an amount of time. And for me, what would build trust is that if they changed regulation based on the new data that's being presented. So for instance, it's 100% safe to go out and go golfing. And yet tons of places have shut down their golf courses. If they went, hey, you know what? We overreacted a little bit. We now know this is safe. Golf courses are now open. Trails, they have to run behind you for 5 minutes for you to have any chance at all of becoming infected. We're going to reopen trails. And I think those are very small things for the government to do, but I think that would build a lot of trust for me, saying we are actually reacting to the latest data.
And there's some very simple, creative ways to do those communications too. There's the USPS Every Door Direct Mail. And how much does it cost to print one sheet of paper and send it out? And they already send us our water bills and some other communications. Yeah. Municipalities can use snail mail, and they can send us a sheet a week saying, this is what we believe today. This is how that's different from last week. And these are the changes to what we're doing. They can also buy ads on Facebook and talk to us that way, and some other things.
Yeah, those are interesting. One of the things that I was actually just having a conversation this morning with some other people about is using at the local level, faith communities, because obviously that's a trusted, source. Whether they have faith in me as a physician or not, who knows? But they probably would trust their pastor, otherwise they wouldn't be going to that church. And so that's a potential mechanism to kind of disseminate information. Obviously, if I don't know, you probably have all seen the spread of misinformation through those communities recently as well. But an interesting thing, I took from Bret's story is that trust is essential in government. I think one of the things that's important for us to have a sense of trust in government is that we actually get some sense of say in government. And that really puts some responsibility on us to invest in government at the local level. I think most people just want to leave it up to the community managers and just say, well, they're going to manage it well. And then that can lead to what Bret pointed out, of $42 million that's embezzled from a city. And but it requires civic engagement and an understanding. I think charitable, what I mentioned Ethan does very well is understanding that person in the public health office is having to make some really challenging decisions as far as priorities of, I mean, I just have to imagine that the public health office, has been underfunded for decades. And now they're tasked with, trying to manage this massive health crisis that we haven't faced for 100 years. And that it's really difficult. And so they're going to get some things wrong, as even Ethan pointed out. They're going to get some things wrong in this response. But instead of assigning suspicion to that, we should engage with them and say, hey, we want to be proactive members of our community. These are some areas we think might be reasonable, and create some dialogue. Our county Riverside County did open up the golf courses 2 weeks ago with some guidelines, fortunately. But yeah, I mean, this is immensely challenging for decision-making, I think, for local governments. The other thing I wanted to comment on is that, I think it's easy for the conservative end of the spectrum to say the lowest form of government is the most effective. But what Bret's story illustrates is that's not necessarily the truth either. That local government can be just as corrupt as federal government, at least in my view. And so assigning the primary responsibility of governance is not always best at the local level.
And I agree with that, but we're going to say the same thing, so I'll say it, and then Ethan, you can say it better. That is completely true. The local government is not immune to corruption, but it is most easily changed. I know that the city of Beaumont could restore its confidence, or it can restore the confidence of its citizens much more quickly than the federal government would be able to restore the confidence and unify its citizenry. Okay, Ethan, workshop that. Or disagree.
I was going to again agree in principle like you did, that yes, it's not necessarily any better. But to your point, Chad, you said one of the things that gives us trust is the feeling that we have a say in it. Well, the larger the scope of government, the less access it has to that level of trust, because the more people who it has to give a say to.
Absolutely.
And one of my feelings about why things have gone kind of pear-shaped on the U.S. government-wise is that we have become disenfranchised through sheer numbers as we've pushed more and more decisions up from local to state and from state to federal. 70 years ago in primary education, nothing existed above the state level. And in some states, nothing existed above the county level. Not curriculum guidelines, not money, nothing. And that meant, like Bret was saying, any problem, that there was with education in my county, I personally could affect. I could go to council meetings and I could start talking to people. And hey, let's get this on track. We have terrible education in our county. Now, if there's a problem with primary education, that's state level, that's in Olympia. I go, forget it. I'll just accept whatever costs come with having whatever system we have, and I'll work on stuff I can control. Maybe I'll send my kids to private school, whatever, right? And when things leap all the way up to the federal, boy, I really let go. I go, gosh, I can't affect that anymore at all, unless I'm willing to just fight or die on that one hill. And there's 30 issues, so I'm probably not. So that's my answer to that.
No,
we've been on for an hour and a half. We probably should talk about how we're going to wrap this session up. And maybe we should end. I mean, it doesn't have to. We don't have to leap right to this, but probably we should end with giving everybody like 1 little minute to kind of do a tale to what they've been talking about.
So okay, so I've been trying to pose this question and nobody seems to take the bait. So part of that is probably the situation now. You know, the situation now is quite different than things were at a month ago. But before I say that, I do want to repose the question. I do want to respond a little bit to that idea of, yes, things have moved up the ladder, so to speak, as far as responsibility, and say that there's definitely negatives to that because it does minimize the involvement of any particular citizen. But then there's also definitely some positives to that, in that the curriculum, because of that, probably shifted around things that would have been very problematic being included in certain states' curriculums that were racist.
Oh yeah, but there's a problem when we can't separate scopes of government. Like, you know, you guys live in Southern California. Do you care what they teach in primary schools 30 miles away or 130 miles away in northern Mexico? No, you don't even know. But you care about what they teach in Maine. Now, if we can't live and let live at any distance, then we're going to be at war all the time, right?
Yeah,
or homogenous. Somebody's going to win the war, and the rest of us are going to surrender or get us.
And I would be, obviously, as I said at the beginning, I'm on the more liberal end of the spectrum, so I'm probably willing to tolerate less difference on something like that than, say, Ethan or Bret.
But we might be able to cultivate the notion that there's my political environment, and there are other political environments. Like there's other parts of the body, right? And sometimes we need a blood-brain barrier to keep things from good things, and it will keep both bad things and good things from crossing.
Right, and probably what I was going to say is I think what I would see the federal involvement in curriculum being is primarily a limited number of things limited number of guidelines that are provided to states, counties, etc. That public schools can't violate those things.
Yeah, that's quite true. That we're far from all the way on education so far with going to federal. Yeah, it's not the one of the extreme examples.
That's an interesting point you make, Ethan, that I hadn't thought about, is that, like, I've lived in Southern California. I was 30 miles from the Mexico border. Never once thought about what those kids are taught. I am very bothered by the fact that Thomas Jefferson was taken out of Texas's history books, and that Alaska, they're now banning books. That bothers me to no end. That's a really interesting thing.
That is very interesting. Okay, so back to my question that I wanted to pose. So let's reverse.
Trying to get away from your question.
Is this our closing statement, Chad? Is our closing statement then answering your question, and then?
I thought that's what I thought would be nice to pose. This would be the nice way to close it. So going back, let's say we were back a month. Things were a lot less uncertain as far as knowledge of the disease process and everything. But let's say we did know, and a month might be far, it might be 2 to 3 weeks, but let's say we did know the things that I covered at the beginning about the viral spread, asymptomatic spread, et cetera. Where would you fall on that kind of spectrum of recommendation, mandate, enforcement, etc. And what would, if you do think that enforcement would be reasonable, what type of enforcement would you put in place? You know, and this is, again, you know, I think it's hard for us to put ourselves back there. But yeah, I was curious. That might create a little different discussion than us sitting here today, or think of as our response differently than us sitting here today and thinking of it in the current moment.
So can I boil that down so we make sure we have a very clear questions being asked? If we
Yeah,
know
sorry,
what we knew now, if we knew what we knew now 3 weeks ago, what would our level of comfort of enforcement versus recommendation be? Is that?
Yeah.
I kind of like the more open, what would we have said should be done?
So if we were the governor.
Yeah.
Yeah, or a county public health officer.
Okay.
How would you move forward?
So I guess
go for it.
Really quickly, before we get to the end of this, we need to just put this in here. So this conversation has been brought to you by Audible. Did you know that with Audible, you can find... No, I'm just kidding. I did
product placement. Nice, Brett.
I did that joke in my last podcast and it killed, so I thought I'd try it in this one too.
Well, also, I'd like to share some good news. I just saved a ton of money on car insurance.
Longest Geico commercial that has ever existed.
I think this needs to be brought by the bakery you went to this morning.
That's true.
Yeah.
Two Lads Bakery in Cherry Valley, California. So I would say, if I was a county health official, if I was responsible for the safety tens of thousands of people in this state or in this community, I would say these are my recommendations based on the current science as we understand it. We strongly encourage the use of masks when engaging with other members of the population that don't live in your home. To go further, we will be enforcing mask usage in community-owned spaces, and that enforcement will be through a citation. Just like there are plenty of things I can't do in a community-owned space, and it will not involve jail time, Houston, but it will involve a citation, and it will be a reasonable amount of money.
It should be the death penalty in Texas, I think, right?
Might as well be.
Do they have any other penalties?
That's my.
Wow, Brett! Like I am surprised because I figured you would just go down the recommendation route. So
no, I agree with Ethan and probably you guys. If it's a community-owned space, that means it's not owned by the city, but it's owned by the members of that community, and I'm responsible for protecting the members of that community.
Okay, so would you include stores as part of that community-owned space, or would you leave that up to their decision making?
It's up to each business to decide for themselves what they want their customers to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say very similar. I'd say it's, again, strongly recommended that everyone use masks anytime they're out of their house. I want to coordinate with the health department to make sure people did that right. I mean, I see terrible practices about masks. So I would try to get that communication flowing if I could. I would say, same thing. There's going to be citations, and here's the thing: they're going to be minimal. They're going to be as minimal as possible, because this is a message. It's going to be like $10. It's not even going to be $100. I mean, a quarter, you don't have a job right now. I'm not going to fine you $100.
It's jaywalking.
Yeah. There we go.
Is this what you're talking about, Ethan? Is this what you're talking about?
And certainly no jail time or anything else, right? I'm going to talk to my police force. I'm going to tell them, look, I don't care how recent you are out of the academy. This is the attitude that you need to be approaching citizens with in this case, because this is not business as usual. And so the citizens need to act and respond to government differently. Government needs to communicate with and respond to citizens differently. everything's different. Let's all try to do it right. And then back to what we said, every single week, and you have to tell people what you're going to do, right? That first week, when you realize how it needs to be, you say, and every single week, we're going to revisit the rules that we made and the recommendations we made. We're going to tell you if we were wrong. We're going to tell you what the new ones are. And then give them a way to talk back. It doesn't have to be, obviously, they can't show up at City Hall these days, right? But give them a complaint hotline, give them a place to comment something, and then you come back to them, you the city manager or whatever, and just to let them know you've heard them. You're not going to argue with them or anything like that. You're going to make them feel like they're really heard. So you're not giving them the PR response, but you're engaging with them. You're probably asking more questions than you're even stating anything, and you're making sure they feel heard. And try to stay on top of it without making people feel like the government is doing something to them instead of for them.
All right. I like your guys' viewpoint. That's excellent. Peter.
I think I would start with you're safer at home. We're not going to require you to stay at home. There's guidelines around that, but I think you're probably safer at home. I think I would take it a step further on the masks. I think I would require masks anytime you're in public space or retail. The reason for that is I like, in theory, Ethan's point about being able to say, we're a hospital, you've engaged in risky behavior, we're not going to treat you, but that isn't an option that's available, and there's no easy way to do that. And so I think, and for that police officer that has to go up and give a ticket, he's at risk by interacting with that person. And so I like the idea of small fines because the economy is hurting, and weekly dialogue. I think the other important point that I would make is that, hey, this is the best information we have right now, and this is a temporary thing. The minute we have any evidence that this isn't necessary, we're going to take it away, and we will have weekly discussions around this to make sure that you guys are comfortable with where we're at. Not necessarily that you agree with it, but that you're getting the best information from us. And we'll do that in whatever forums are safe, and that's going to be updated as well on a weekly basis. So there may come a point where we can have a microphone in the park and people are 6 feet apart or whatever that is. But we're gonna continue to update the guidelines to give you as much freedom as is safely possible as far as these masks go on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I like all of the options that have been posed. I think they would have all been actually reasonably effective if you're requiring people to wear, or mandating and enforcing people to wear masks in any public space. The likelihood that they're going to continue doing that into a retail store is high. Although I probably would go along with Peter here, where I would require it in retail spaces as well. I like the idea of the low fine, although I'm wondering, how people would feel about that, whether it's toothless or not, and therefore just kind of meant to be annoying kind of thing. I don't know. I just wonder how people would take it seriously, but I do kind of like the idea of a low fine because of the economic situation. So I guess I probably am a little bit more on the enforcement side, but not much compared to Ethan and Bret on this. Which is, I think that's where I think, this illustrates we're all closer. If we have the data and understand it, we're all closer than we probably realize.
Yeah. I just watched Waco, so the second time you get a ticket, the ATA is busting down on your door. They're shooting the place up. It's just chaos.
Well, and I think that at the fine side of things, community service is as somebody who has done some community service for his city, at the gentle encouragement of a judge. How
many felons do we have in this chat?
You would have spent 3 months in jail if you hadn't.
Well, yeah, it was a choice. I got the freedom of choice. But I could see the utility in low fines or low hours of community service, or increasing those based on how many times you've been cited, where you're cited, things like that. I think that is an area where I would give my government the ability to help determine that.
Yeah, I like a lot of violations. The first time it happens, the government basically going, dude, you're not supposed to do that, right?
Yeah.
And the second time it goes, okay, we're serious. It's $100. And the third time it's, okay, we're now going to do whatever it takes to stop you from doing that again because you're not listening. And that can actually ramp up very quickly.
What if it wasn't monetary? What if the second time you got one, you had to wear a sign that said, I put my community at risk in front of stores and wear a mask?
Hey, I'm with you.
That's compelled speech. You can't do that.
Oh, worst.
Ethan has a very big problem with that.
Well,
let's stay in the zone of agreement here, folks. Now, how are we going to wrap this up? Because we're going on 2 hours soon.
I thought that was wonderful. I thought that was a great wrap up. Maybe we'll come back with the second episode.
I hope so.
I wrote down, I took notes on the number of topics and added a few. So potentials for next week